Okay, the recording's on, and we'll begin the presentation. Today's presentation is a 510K frequently asked questions presentation. I haven't done this before. I was in the process of trying to generate a frequently asked questions page for 510Ks like I had done in the past for CE marking that's on my website. But rather than try to gather questions from other sources as to what people had for frequently asked questions, instead what I tried to do was I actually said, why don't I just ask the people that are subscribing for the event to ask their own questions. So in order to subscribe for this event, everybody had to submit a question, and all of you did, and I thank you very much for that. And some of you have already received email responses from me with a detailed answer, and some of them have actually been published as blogs. So my intent is to go back and publish a blog for each person that has submitted a frequently asked question, and that'll really help me generate additional content that's of interest to everybody. Okay, our first question was related to obsolete standards. The person asked if the information that was required for a previous standard has changed, so now that standard's obsolete and there's a new standard, a new version of the standard out, and they're not quite sure whether the testing that they performed in the past, maybe for CE marking, meets the new requirements for the 510K. What should they do? Is it sufficient to just do a gap analysis? And if the differences between the old version and the new version are not significant, can they just go ahead and submit and declare it's conforming? And the answer to that in general is no. Yes, you should do a gap analysis, but if there are differences, you have to show data to address the differences. You can't just say, they're not that significant, so don't worry about it. And there was a reason why they changed the standards, and they want you to do the testing according to that new one. So if they've made a change, you're going to have to do at least some testing to cover the bridge between the old version and the new version. And specifically, one of the common ones out there is sterilization. They didn't change the sterilization standards all that long ago, so I actually had a client early in this year. They had done the testing last year. This standard had changed. All the testing was done to an old version, and their testing didn't meet the new version's requirements, and so therefore they had to redo all their entire sterilization validation testing. Now, unlike the European Union, where the European Union says you have to maintain your testing to the current version of the standard or the state of the art, the US FDA doesn't require that. Once you have a product cleared and it's safe and effective, they don't require you to continue to update your testing unless you make a change to the device. So if you don't make a change, you don't have to do any new testing. And that's quite different from what the Europeans are requiring, where they require you to maintain the state of the art. So it's really important that you not just check what is the current standard that's recognized by the FDA, but also make sure that's the most current standard, period. Because it's very possible that you could have a standard that is in the process of being recognized by the FDA that was revised last year, and you could get halfway through your submission and then all the standards change and you have to redo all your testing, and that would be very painful and expensive. And I actually had that happen to a client where the sterilization standard was just one of the standards that changed on them. They actually had 6 different standards change all at the same time, all within a couple of weeks of each other, and it was just before we were about to submit. So we had to redo all our testing, and it wasn't acceptable to the FDA to submit a gap analysis. We tried that for sterilization because we knew we couldn't complete that in time, and they wouldn't accept it. They said, please provide, after you've completed the testing, resubmit. So we didn't have to pay another fee, but now they're on crunch time trying to finish all the retesting before their 180 days is up, and they may not make it. They may have to pay for the entire submission again and resubmit everything. And if they deliver even 1 day late on the 181st day, your entire submission gets deleted automatically. The FDA won't save it for you, and so you're going to be stuck. And there's no way to extend that beyond the 180 days. So that's something that you need to keep in mind when you're addressing standards. Now, if your company is trying to figure out what are the right standards, what are the most current standards, Here's the example I was talking about. I had 7 of 17 standards for one submission change between April 1st and July 1. That's a lot of standards to change. So if you want to know what the most current standard is, the link at the bottom of this page gives you how to search the database at the FDA for what is the current recognized standard, and then you fill in each of those standards that are recognized in this FDA Form 3654 for the standards and explain how you comply with it. Next question was, when do you need a new 510K? So unfortunately, this person, I believe, missed my previous webinar on 510K hardware and software documentation, where I specifically addressed the 2 new guidance documents that were recently released, one for changes in general to devices, and I used hardware as an example, but a lot of that presentation covered how do you know when a device had a modification to it that's going to require a 510K submission, and I reviewed the new guidance document briefly that talks about when you have to resubmit and when you don't. And the most significant part of that guidance document, yes, the FDA made some changes to the decision trees. They don't feel that they're substantial. I'm not sure all of us would agree, but they don't think they're significant. But the most significant thing, I think, in that entire submission is not the decision tree changes that they made, but the detailed examples that they provided at the end on how they want you to document your decision as to whether it needs to be a new 510K or not. That documentation is far more detailed than typically companies will submit to their own letter to file. So now the FDA is setting the bar with a guidance document saying this is what we expect in your change notifications internally for a letter to file, and we expect you to learn that and follow that. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would suggest watching that webinar on hardware and software documentation. I also covered the software modification guidance document. There had been no previous guidance document on software modifications, and it goes through the 6 different decisions. The first 2, if you're correcting a flaw in your program because some bug occurred, maybe there was an update to Microsoft or something, and you have to bring it back into compliance, or if you're addressing a cybersecurity issue, those 2 types of changes don't require a 510K submission, but all the other 4 you had to make a decision, and it wasn't clear-cut whether it would be a required resubmission or not. So I think that guidance document is extremely helpful as well. This particular example, the person was asking about raw materials triggering a new 510K submission, and in general, just changing the raw material won't necessarily require a resubmission if you perform the same testing and you have the same acceptance criteria. For instance, we're going to redo 10993 testing, and we're going to show that this material is also biocompatible and doesn't present any new risks. Another possible scenario when you would not need to submit a new 510K is if you've already used that same material for a similar product with a similar intended use, then they also wouldn't need to submit a new 510K for that. But colors fall into this too. So if you change the color of something, the colorants need to have biocompatibility testing for it. So if you don't have the biocompatibility testing for that colorant, you're going to have to do an assessment just like you would for any other material change to decide whether that requires a 510K submission. If that's the only type of change you're making, you're just changing the color and you're redoing the testing and you have the same acceptance criteria that you had before, you probably won't have a 510K submission required. But you have to follow those decision trees, and I believe the guidance document that they publish even addresses that specific example. And if you want to learn more about it, here's the picture of the guidance document on when to submit a 510K, and it provided a link at the bottom for the current version, this new draft, as well as the previous version that's still effective in place until the new version's passed. And then here's the slide for the software. So slide 6 is the software modifications and a link to that guidance document. So those are both August guidance documents that were released. Slide 7 was another question. They asked, how much interaction should you have with your lead reviewer? And I haven't had a chance yet to publish this as a blog, but I did publish it as a LinkedIn announcement to a medical devices group, a QARA subgroup that I manage. And every Monday I send out an announcement to people that's sort of like a blog, and oftentimes I do a longer version of that as my blog. And so I'm falling a little bit behind, so I expect to publish this at some point as a blog. But for now, I believe I sent off a copy of this to the person. If they didn't get it, please send me an email and I'll resend. But I explained that it depends a little bit whether you're working with the FDA or you're working with CE marking technical reviewer. If you're working with the FDA, the FDA does not want you to call them or email them to ask the status of a submission ever. They do not want you to do this. They specifically say they don't want you to do this. The process is very well defined. They have a guidance document for it. They track metrics on each of the different stages of the 510K process, and they report the performance on that in an annual report and talk about gaps in their performance and how they're going to address it, and they're held accountable to Congress. So they don't need every single company that they're doing a 510K for asking that question too. The first step is they're supposed to run your e-copy in their system and upload it to their computer. That's supposed to happen within 7 days. It typically happens the same day. It's rare for it to take more than 24 hours. And in my LinkedIn announcement, I explained an example where I had to take more than the 1 day, and I waited for 4 days rather than waiting the full 7. And then on the 4th day, I sent off an email directly to the document center, not to any specific reviewer, to the document center, just saying I had submitted 2 submissions on the same day, both were received. I had the tracking information verifying that. One was received and acknowledged immediately, the other one there was no response, so I thought that was odd, and I was worried the submission had been lost, and I just wanted to confirm it had been received. And within a very short amount of time of that emailing going over, my submission was acknowledged. So it was probably just misplaced, but they were able to find it very quickly, and I didn't escalate it up the food chain and talk to a branch chief or something and complain. I was just saying it was odd that both of these were received on the exact same day at the exact same time in the exact same shipment, and one was acknowledged right away and one was not. And after 4 days, I thought it was worth contacting the FDA. So that is something that I would do. For CE marking, it's totally different. Because CE marking, you have a much more interactive relationship with your notified body. They don't have federal oversight, and you're comparing the performance of one notified body versus another when you select those notified bodies. So it's a valid question. Why, what are you doing for me to try to get this reviewed quicker? Because sometimes you're paying for an expedited review. So if you're doing a 510K, you have that first step, then the second step is the RTA review. That's usually day 14, day 15, you're getting an RTA response, whether it was accepted or not. And then between day 15, when the RTA review is done, and day 60, when they're supposed to make a decision as to whether it's going to be an interactive review or request for additional information, there's 45 days of time that you may hear absolutely nothing. That's called the substantive review phase. And that is not a time to talk to the reviewer. Even though you know the reviewer, you know their email, you know their phone number, I do not recommend contacting them and adding more to their plate, like another email to respond to. Wait it out. If you don't hear anything, that's probably good news. When they get to yours, and they're working on a queue, when they get to yours, they will go through the review and they will ask questions if they have any. If they don't have any questions, you might just get a 510K letter. More likely, you're going to get either interactive review or a request for additional information, and you can't speed that process up. And if you try to speed the process up, you might just make the person irritated, and you might get worse performance. So I don't recommend contacting them every week. I think this person asked if weekly status checks were excessive. Any requests are excessive. Wait until your 60 days are up. If you hear nothing at 60 days, then it's appropriate to send one email. That's it. So it really should be limited. The next question was about customer feedback and post-market surveillance, and did I have any recommendations for free tools that could be used for customer feedback? So the answer to that is There are lots of tools out there. I don't have a specific one that I use all the time, and I think this is the best one, and I recommend it to you. But I do think there needs to be a paradigm shift in the way we capture customer feedback for post-market surveillance. If you think back to olden days before computers existed, people gathered information by surveys paper-wise in asking them face-to-face, sometimes by phone. Once we converted over to the computer age, we started doing things electronically by email, and we would send out surveys electronically. And now we have automated tools for gathering customer feedback like SurveyMonkey. And so there are a lot of really good tools out there for gathering that information, but the folks in QA and RA that are gathering post-market surveillance for medical devices don't use those tools very often, whereas their marketing counterparts in the same organization probably use them all the time. And they already have an account and already have the tools and are very good at them. So my recommendation is, instead of having people in QA/RA trying to use different ways of doing customer feedback, instead hand that off to marketing and get that information if you're not already doing that. I know a lot of companies are doing that, but not all of you. In addition to that, the best way to gather more customer feedback and more post-market surveillance is to develop email subscriber lists of actual customers that are using your product. So that's a key thing to gather. It helps you on sales as well. But you need to start gathering that information. Now, if you're gathering any imaging data or gathering patient outcomes, or you're gathering clinical data or patient names, that's confidential patient information that you're not supposed to have. So delete it when you receive it, edit it out of the record so it's not shared with people. You're not supposed to gather that information, and doctors shouldn't be giving it to you. In addition to that, if you are gathering that information, it should only be in the form of a clinical study, and there should be informed consent, and you should have permission to use that for a clinical study. In those cases, you really ought to have boilerplate informed consent documents that are in place, and you should be doing it in a very controlled way. You don't want to be violating any of the clinical trial regulations under 812, and you really need a clinical expert helping you with that. And that might be your clinical head of clinical affairs, or your director of clinical studies, or it could be a clinical research associate you've hired, or a chief medical officer. But that's something you really should be paying attention to. And I believe the future of medical devices is really going to be very similar to other types of products out there, where we have a lot of apps that are on phones and mobile apps and iPads, where we're gathering post-market surveillance, and we allow our customers to reorder product as well. But at the same time, I think we're going to be doing it in a smart way so we don't accidentally acquire confidential information we're not supposed to have, unless we're doing a post-market clinical follow-up study or a clinical study. Okay, the next question was about decision trees. This kind of relates back to the other question that I believe I had earlier. So it was talking about, when do you submit a new 510K? And the person was looking for a simpler way of doing these decision trees. And I can tell you that there really is no simple way of doing these decision trees. They are complex. This is why the FDA's first attempt at a new draft guidance document failed and was pulled back. And the new ones appear to be better, and they did a training, but almost every single question people asked, instead of getting a nice simple response, the FDA said, we can't answer specific questions to specific devices. There's no simple answer. So even the FDA is saying this, consultants are saying this, you really need to do this on a case-by-case basis. There's no simple instructions. I did the best I could with explaining these flowcharts in my presentation that I've given a hyperlink for. The FDA has some free ones that I give you links to in that presentation as well, but I actually attended that live session, and I thought it wasn't nearly as helpful as what I had developed, so I didn't get much out of it. But I think everybody that has done this before will admit that this is not easy, and there is no simple way to do these decision trees. The next question was interesting. It was worded as essential design outputs. How does the FDA define them, and where do they come from? There is no place anywhere that I'm aware of where essential design outputs is defined by the FDA. That specific wording I don't believe it is. And I'm wondering if the person is more familiar with European products where we have essential principles or essential requirements, which would be Annex 1 in the MDD. We don't have that for the FDA. We don't have essential requirements for safety and effectiveness for devices as a whole. However, on a case-by-case basis, there are special controls guidances for some Class 2 devices that say what those testing requirements are and what performance criteria there are and what safety and testing they might have to do. And one example that I used earlier today in another webinar on device description, I was talking about dental handpieces. So the FDA specifically says in their performance testing section, we recommend that you describe the following parameters, and I bulleted those all out. So it's just a copy and paste from the guidance document, but these are all the things the FDA expects you to define in the product. When a product's been around for a long time and there are multiple versions of the product by multiple manufacturers, it gets to the point where they know pretty much what information they need to know to make a decision whether you're safe and effective and whether you are substantially equivalent to a predicate device. So they've come up with this list for dental handpieces. There could be exceptions to this, but in general this is the list, and the way the FDA defines it is in their special controls guidance document, if they have one. And where do they come from? They come from a big history or body of 510Ks for predicates with the same device classification. The next question had to do with risk reports. And for this one, I actually published a blog on it. Or I haven't published it. I wrote a blog on it, and it will be published very shortly, so this person should be getting an email soon relating to risk reports. But risk reports are included in a risk management file, but they're not required for the FDA 510Ks. 510Ks, the only time risk is required at all is in software. And that's not meaning that you don't have to analyze risk for the product ever. It's just for the 510K process, you don't need to submit risk management data or risk analysis. It's only for the risk analysis of software that you have to submit it. And then you only have to submit it for medium, moderate level of risk and high level of risk software devices. You do indirectly have to do a submission of a risk analysis for hardware when you have electrical safety issues. As part of the IEC 6601 testing, you have to present your risk management file. But the FDA does recognize ISO 14971 for risk management, and when the inspectors come on site 2 years after you have received your 510K, they will look to see that the risks that you have identified in your risk management file match up with the complaints that you're seeing and the adverse events you're seeing, and they expect those to be updated when necessary. And if you're not doing that, they're going to indicate that you get a 483 because you haven't identified these risks that are in your complaints and your adverse events in your risk management file. So that's something they'll specifically be looking for during the inspections that are routine rather than during the 510K clearance process. Okay. This next slide, slide 12, we have another question here where the person is asking about what are the differences between the two types and the contents required, and whether you should choose a traditional 510K or an abbreviated 510K. All things being equal, if you have a choice, you'd always pick an abbreviated 510K rather than a traditional 510K, because the FDA's timeline for a traditional 510K is 90 days. Their target for abbreviated is 60 days, and the special 510Ks are 30 days. The special 510Ks are hard to do because you have to have a previous device on the market that you've modified slightly. The abbreviated 510Ks are only allowed when you have another recognized standard like an ISO standard or a special controls guidance document that you can follow for conformity to essential requirements for performance and safety. And if you don't have that, you can't do an abbreviated 510K. But not all products have an abbreviated have a special controls guidance document, so you have to have that kind of document to make sure that it's okay. And if you're not sure, you could ask in a pre-sub meeting if that's allowed. And not all devices you will even be able to find all the special controls guidance documents, so you have to look very carefully. But to give you an idea of how common this is, I've given you the breakdown here from an article that I already wrote, and I gave you a link also for the blog. The next question has to do with special controls guidance documents. The person was asking if you could, how to find special controls guidance document. Is there always one? No, there is not always a special controls guidance document. I give you some examples here. So I included the link for the dental one that I was talking about earlier, but there are other types of special controls guidance documents as well, and they have to do with specific performance requirements. They have ones for electromagnetic compatibility, EMC. They have one for applicability of ISO 10993, the Biocompatibility standard. They have one for electrical safety testing. They have one for cybersecurity that I've listed here. They have another one for post-market management of cybersecurity, telling you when you need it and when you don't. So there's a lot of different types of guidance documents out there, but I give you the wording of these. One says pre-market submissions, another one says post-market management, and another one here says pre-market notification 510Ks. And then we have other ones that say special controls guidance. So you have 4 different things you could be looking under. So it might be necessary to really look very carefully through a lot of different guidance documents to make sure you're not missing one, or talk with a consultant like myself that has identified them. But even every once in a while, I make mistakes too. I was doing my first needle submission, and I wasn't aware that the FDA has a separate guidance document for needles, and it wasn't listed under the 3-letter product code, which is where it should be. It wasn't listed in any of the previous submissions that I was looking at as predicates, and because this seemed like a very straightforward submission, I didn't expect the FDA to have a guidance document I wasn't aware of. But they made me aware of it after we submitted, and we had to do some additional testing. So that's another example of why it really pays to do a pre-sub meeting. But in this particular case, if you're fairly confident you know the pathway, you might simply just go ahead and do a pre-sub meeting request, which are free, and ask for a response from the FDA by email. I would go ahead and prepare your submission in parallel with that, because it's unlikely they're going to identify new testing requirements or identify a special controls guidance document. But if they did, you might learn about it before you actually submit your 510K, and that would be nice. So this next question had to do with shelf life. They asked if you can you submit additional real-time shelf life data at the end of the 510K review period, and will it extend your review time? So the answer here is you need some sort of shelf life data with every submission, or you will get your submission rejected in the RTA review. However, you are not required to submit real-time aging. You can submit accelerated aging instead. And I've included a little table here at the bottom. It shows you the calculated, and this is using an actual formula that's recognized out there, for correlating accelerated aging at 55 degrees Celsius with real-time equivalent at 22 degrees Celsius. And so 6 months real-time is 19 days accelerated. So you can get the information that you need in a very short amount of time using accelerated aging, and the FDA allows you to do the real-time aging concurrently with release of your product. So you could do all your sterilization, do your take one set of samples, let's say 3 boxes of product, and put it on the shelf for real-time aging at 22 degrees Celsius room temperature, and then take another box and put it in an incubator with controlled temperature and humidity at 55 degrees Celsius for, let's say, 74 days. And at the end of 74 days, you do your testing, and you claim 2 years or 24 months shelf life based on that accelerated aging, but you don't have the real-time aging data for another 18 months or so or longer. But that's okay. The FDA allows it, and you don't have to submit the real-time aging data. And in fact, in the blog that I'm in the process of writing, I give an example of a 510K submission where in the 510K summary, they actually state that they're going to continue to do testing and extend the date beyond 2 years So they gave an example where we did 2 years of testing data. We're claiming 2 years now, but we fully intend to extend it out to 5 years and do real-time aging for 5 years. But we're not going to do a new 510K to show that data. We're just going to have a letter to file, and we're going to use the same test method and the same acceptance criteria just for a longer period. And the FDA allows that. That's not a problem at all. If you don't have any shelf life data, though, you will get it rejected, and they're going to ask for some information. So if you have nothing, go for 6 months, and then in parallel with the review, get your 12-month, your 24-month accelerated aging data. And it's always advised by labs that are doing this and have been there and done that before to pick a midpoint. So if you're trying for 5 years, pick something that's 2, 2.5, 3 years, just in case you fail the 5-year time point. And you'll have the result for 5 years accelerated before you'll have 1 year of real-time done, so you can adjust your protocol for the real-time aging to match up with what passed for accelerated aging later and not have to restart the whole entire experiment. Next question asked, a question I've never been asked before, but it's a good question. Why don't we have expiration dates for 510Ks? It would be a great idea, but we don't have them. We do have expiration dates for CE mark certificates. So your CE certificate will say it's only good for 5 years, and then it has to be renewed. The FDA has a very different policy. Once you have done the testing, you've demonstrated substantial equivalence, and you've got a clearance, you don't have to do any more testing unless you make a device change. So that's saving you a lot of testing and updating all your documentation. However, it doesn't mean that you're not required to take corrective action if you see adverse events and trends that suggest your design has a problem. And it doesn't prevent the FDA from forcing you to take a product off the market because there is a problem with that device inherently, and it's no longer considered safe from a clinical benefit risk clinical standpoint. They haven't done that very often. The Europeans are much more likely to do that, but it is possible that they could do that. So no expiration dates on 510Ks. They even let you use things that are obsolete. They let you use things as predicates that were never even put on the market. But in general, it's supposed to be a legally marketed device, but there are exceptions to that. In fact, I'm working on a 510K now for a client where the 510K is decades old. So, but the FDA is still allowing them to use their own device as a predicate, even though it was taken off the market and now they want to put it back on the market. The next question had to do with 510K planning and project management. So it was a startup company, and they wanted to know how to prepare their 510K submission for their first product, how to come up with a plan, a budget, personnel, facilities, all those things that are required. So this question I've actually has been asked before and answered before. It's really kind of a two-step process. The first step that I recommend for companies is to get a regulatory pathway analysis to make sure that the product is eligible for a 510K in determining what the testing requirements are, including any special controls guidance documents that might be identified in identifying a predicate. So that process, if it were just US only, it probably takes me about 4 hours work. If it's other countries as well, it might take me 6 to 8 hours of work, but I actually offer that as a flat fee service on my website for $1,500. But if clients only want US and it's a fairly straightforward product, I've done it for as low as $1,000. In addition to that, I've also provided a link here for 510K project management. There is a YouTube webinar out there, if you can find it, that Joe Hage published. So if you're part of the medical devices group, you can look on his webinars, and you can find the 510K tips webinar that I recorded a long time ago for free, but there is a more recent one on 510K project management that I've actually provided a link for here that you can purchase from my website. And I've actually got a lessons learned 510K as well that also provides some additional information on 510K project management. But in general, what I recommend to companies is they start out with a regulatory pathway analysis, and then they get a copy of my free template on table of contents, and they plan out their submission based on the 20 sections. But in general, the way I start is I make sure I have the testing plan in place first, and I work my way backwards from the submission date. So I try to have all the all the testing done, and I want to submit the day that the last test is done, so I make sure that all the documents that are supporting that are written in parallel with the testing, and I fill in the blanks as I get the test results. So I pursue the two activities in parallel, and at the very end of the project, I actually, when the last test report comes in, then we actually submit a 510K. To give you some more details on this, I borrowed a couple slides from that presentation. Some of you might be wondering what a product classification is and how to determine the one for your product that you're developing. So here's a couple of ways. I give you the link to the product classification database the FDA has. You identify a device similar to yours. So I think I actually did a blog on this where I used the case study of a topical adhesive similar to Surgiseal, and we typed in the word adhesive and we looked through it and we found all these letters. We identified the 3-letter product code, and we went on to identify a predicate product. And you can also go on the total product lifecycle database and find additional products. For 510K, I have a link there for the 510K format that's required. I actually give you a way to download my 510K template for free. The 510K typically has 20 sections or volumes, and I explain how to create a template for that. There's also an FDA e-copy guidance that tells you how to create an e-copy, and there's an RTA checklist that I also provide a link for. But understanding all this, you really need to get a little bit of training on it if you're going to do it yourself. But I'm also going to be offering a workshop in March in San Diego, and then in April for Chicago, and I'm writing a book that'll be available to some early people in January if you're interested. Next slide here, I talk in the 510K project management webinar about team member selection, and I think this is an important point that goes right to what this person was asking in their question. How do you know what people you're going to need, what you're going to need consultants for, what you're not going to need consultants for? There are some boilerplate sections you do not need consultants for. I can give you templates. I've actually provided one template along with this slide deck, but there are a bunch of templates that are available out there that are very easy to fill out, and that'll help you with some of the sections. Those are the boilerplate sections, if you will. Then there's declarations of conformity. I'm actually going to be doing a webinar very soon on how to do declarations of conformity. That's section 9 of your submission. But I actually showed a little bit of that where you fill out the recognized standards form, form 3654, and you identify all the recognized standards, like 10993 would be an example, the IEC 6601 would be an example, any of your sterility standards would be examples. So that's for each person that's doing those testing, they should fill out their own declaration of conformity or get the lab that's doing the testing to help you with it, and they should be able to do it. If they can't, probably the wrong lab. For biocompatibility and sterility, that's section 14 and 15 of your 510K submission, and you really should have somebody with a microbiology background doing that. I'm an example, but I work with a lot of people that know even more than I do about that, and they help with filling out those sections. For software and electromagnetic compatibility or hardware, electrical safety, these are sections 16 and 17 of your submission, and I actually have a free webinar by a software expert, Nancy Nattel, talking about how to fill out the software section and the 11 documents needed for software documentation in addition to the overview. And then I work a lot with Leo Eisner and a few other experts on electrical safety if you need help with those pieces. I'm actually giving a webinar next Friday on labeling and UDI requirements for the labeling section of a 510K submission, so you might be interested in that. That's for section 13. And then for performance testing, I've actually written a blog about that in the past, but I'm going to be doing some more training on that through webinars. But typically most companies have benchtop testing, but for some products the FDA requires in their special controls guidance that you need to do animal testing. Sometimes they'll tell you how many animals. Another form would be cadaver testing. That would go under bench testing. Sometimes they do sawbone testings for orthopedic devices. And sometimes you have clinical studies that are required. A lot of the wound healing products in some of the simulated use studies, like they require a simulated use study with human users for needles. So that would be an example of something that was actually in the special controls guidance document for the needles. So that's something to look at. There's also some information on clinical studies that's required for Sections 7 and 8, because one of those has to do with declaration of Class 3, and another one has to do with financial disclosure for the investigators. This question was submitted, and I answered it in an earlier webinar today about device descriptions. The person was asking in the accessories section of a device description for accessories that are already cleared, what do we have to provide? And if the accessory is not already cleared, what do we have to provide? So in your device description, you're going to list all your accessories, and you're going to list if the data for equivalence and safety and performance is included in the submission, or it's previously cleared under a 510K and there have been no changes. And you can just provide a table of that information. But if you don't have a 510K number and it's a new accessory or a modified accessory, you're going to have to include that information in the submission rather than somewhere else. It has to be included in the submission. It doesn't have to be included in that particular device description section. It would be included in the various sections. So you would, if you were doing, let's say, an air filter and you needed a new modified air filter as an accessory, you're going to have to do shelf life testing for that. You're going to have to do sterility testing for that. You're going to have to do packaging validation for it. You're going to do performance testing, which would be benchtop testing for an air filter. All these things are going to have to be done for an air filter, even though it's just an accessory. You still need to provide that data, and it has to be included in the submission. That's why they want to know all the accessories that are going to be covered in that submission, and it has to be clearly stated in multiple places. For UDI barcodes, I had a couple of people ask a few weeks back whether UDI barcodes are going to be required in a 510K submission. There were some blogs posted by some competitors that indicated that it probably would be and could slow down your submission. The best thing to do when you have a theory about things like this is to go straight to the horse's mouth. So you go to the FDA and you actually ask the FDA's UDI help desk, will you be requiring this in 510K submissions after September 24th when the UDI requirements become required for all Class 2 devices? And the UDI help desk said, no, they will not. We will not require UDI codes as part of the submission. You will be required to have it before you launch your product, but not as part of the submission. And then I asked a follow-up question, do you need to provide a dummy UDI code as part of your label? And they said, no, you can, but you don't have to. And so the idea would be you put a little box that says UDI barcode will go here, so they know where it's going to be and they know you haven't forgotten it, but you don't have to provide it because you might not have it yet. That does not mean you shouldn't start getting it right away, because it takes a long time to set up your UDI barcodes, and the more product codes you have in your company, the longer it's going to take. Every configuration could potentially require that, so you really need to pursue that early, but it doesn't need to be part of submission. Now in my template, I left a column for UDI barcodes, but you can delete that column if you don't have UDI barcodes. There's no reason to put NA there, just delete the column. Next question was about confidentiality statements. If you want the whole world not to know that you have a 510K pending, what you should do is fill out a confidentiality statement according to the regulations and include it in your 510K submission. So I usually include that in Section 3 as one of the documents. And for everybody that's received this slide deck, you should have also received a copy of that template, and I referenced the regulations that tell you the exact wording that they want you to use. So that's very helpful. So always look out for templates the FDA already provides and wording that they want you to use, just like the they have other documents like the truthful and accuracy statement would be an example. Another example would be the indication for use has a form that they want you to use. So you need to be looking for those particular templates. Now if you read carefully through what my document says, it says that if you show this product at trade shows and marketing other events publicly, then the FDA has to be notified, so you can they're going to be able to divulge that yes, you've got a 510K pending. And I haven't ever known somebody that's actually done that, but you have to be very, very careful when you're at trade shows talking about a product that's 510K pending. In general, that's not a good idea, because what if your 510K is rejected? So everybody wants to talk about their new product as early as they can, but you fill out the certification of confidentiality for a reason, and part of this certification states that you're not going to tell people all about your product before you get a 510K. And if you do, you're supposed to notify the FDA and let them know that you've already presented this at a trade show, but you've said it's 510K pending. So there is language around that confidentiality statement. The next question was about third-party reviews. Do I have any experience submitting 510K for third-party review? I personally have never submitted something to a third-party reviewer. And part of that has to do with the products that I have worked on weren't eligible for third-party review. Excuse me. Very few products are actually eligible for third-party review, and the third-party reviewers only have certain product classification codes that they can actually do that for. So a little while ago, I published a blog on abbreviated and special and traditional 510Ks, but I went back to that same data subset and I added in third-party reviews. So only 11 submissions out of 260 during the month of September were third-party reviewed. And I suspect Mark Jobe probably had his hand in about 3/4 of those, because he does so many reviews of the same type and he's very fast at them. So if he does reviews of the type of product that you are producing, you definitely want to go to him, because he's going to get it done really fast, and you'll get it through the FDA a lot faster that way, or get through the whole process a lot faster that way. But not everything can be submitted that way, so you need to know the type of that you have and be aware of which third parties can do it and which third parties cannot do it. And I'll be publishing a blog on that very soon, and it will be in my book too. So next slide here just talks about next Friday's webinar. It's going to be about labeling and the UDI requirements for labeling in a 510K submission. It's going to be at noon on Eastern time, and I've provided a link there for registering for that. And if you have any questions, now's the time to ask in the chat box or shoot me an email. And I've already got one question on here. One person says, how can I receive your blogs? So that's very easy. You go on to medicaldeviceacademy.com/blog, and that's how you will get it. You look at any of my blogs or go to that page that has all the blogs. On the right-hand side of the table or right-hand side of the page, there is a form to fill in to subscribe to my blogs. As soon as you hit subscribe or enter, then it will send you an email. You're going to have to click on confirm, because it's a double-step process. You click on confirm, and now you've agreed to be subscribed. And on the bottom of all the emails you'll receive, it will give you an option to unsubscribe as well. The next question that was asked is, can I use your 510K template for a special 510K as well as traditional? Yes, absolutely. The 510K template that I have for device description is identical for both types of submissions. In general, for a 510K special, you're not required to provide as much detailed information, and you're only required to present the information that's different from the previous 510K submission for them to review. However, if you don't provide enough information, you're going to get a request for additional information. So in general, what I do when I'm doing a special 510K is I write all the documents just as if I were doing a traditional 510K, and then I leave out the information that I'm fairly certain the FDA doesn't need because it hasn't changed. But that way, if the FDA requests it, I already have it available. So that's my strategy for doing special 510Ks. But really the only difference between the two documents is the amount of detail in each section. And somebody else asked for the table of contents, how can we remove the colors filled in by some of the page blocks? So the colors for each of the fields, you go into Microsoft Word and you remove the colors. I use those colors for project management. As we go through the project, I convert the reds to yellows for in progress, blues for need signature from the client. There are only 3 documents that require a signature, and then green at the end when it's ready for e-copy. and the actual version the FDA gets is clear. It doesn't have any color coding at all. But if you're having trouble on that, I could show you how to change the color of the cell in the table in Microsoft Word, but it's just changing the background color in Microsoft Word, so you should be able to do that quite easily with some of the options at the top. But you can also type in the help for Microsoft Word and it'll tell you to change colors. I don't have any more questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go to my email and see if I have some questions there. And so if you have any additional questions you want to type in the chat box, go ahead and do that now. Okay. I have a question from somebody else that was asking what time the webinar was going to start. We're a little bit late on that, but I'll hopefully have the recording for them very shortly so they can show that to people. And I think that's it. I don't see any additional questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for today. Thank you very much for participating in the webinar. And if you have any other questions or you have questions of a confidential nature, I have my Skype address, my email address, and my phone address on here. And keep in mind, we're going to have that new webinar next Friday, and I'll be doing 14 new webinars in the next 12 weeks. So there'll be a lot of activity specific to 510Ks. I'm transcribing the webinars and converting them into documents. And then I'm editing those documents and creating a book that'll be available in January. And then we'll have a couple of workshops in it in the spring, in March and April. So thank you very much, and have a nice day.